Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Suzanne Daniel is a Sydney-based author whose first novel, Allegra in 3 parts, has just been published by Macmillan Australia. A journalist and communications consultant with an impressive list of achievements to her name, Suzanne has written one of the most heartwarming, perceptive, coming-of-age stories I've had the privilege to read. Firmly rooted in 1970s Sydney, this novel took me on a delightful journey down memory lane, following in 11-year-old Allegra's footsteps through her final year at a small Catholic primary school where nuns still played an active teaching role to the intimidating selective high school she qualified entry to, all the while trying to navigate the trinity of adults tasked with the role of looking after her. Allegra in 3 parts is another exceptional debut from a marvellously talented writer, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Suzanne to the podcast today. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. I've said it before, but I'm compelled to say it once more. We seem to be in the midst of a golden era for debut Australian novelists. For every remarkable Aussie debut novel I read, there's yet another one waiting in the wings. Our appetite and indeed the global hunger for Australian stories seems to be growing at a rate of knots. Not that I'm complaining, but do you have a sense of why this is happening, Suzanne?
Hopefully, it's maybe it's a confidence that we as Australian storytellers have grown into. I suppose for so long we looked, we were a little bit coy with our own experience and wondered whether we could even term that as culture. And I think now we've grown up as a nation in so many ways, and we're quite proud of our culture, and perhaps that's one explanation. But I think you're right. I mean, there does seem to be an appetite, not just locally, but also internationally, for Australian stories and universal stories told through an Australian perspective.
And I think for Gen Xers like me, Allegra was highly relatable, despite being only 11 years of age. I mean, she's naive in many ways, yet incredibly astute in others. And I'm wondering how you managed to capture her voice so accurately.
Well, I'm pleased that you did find it that way. I really worked hard at it. My husband will tell you I have a very long memory. So even though I'm well into my adult years, I do remember the feeling of being that age. I've also raised 3 children, so I've had a lot to do, with 11-year-olds on the way through, and I'm an aunt of many nieces and nephews. I'm a godmother of 6 children. I sit on the board of a school. I'm also on the board of a youth development program. So I've had a lot to do with children. I was the eldest of a large family, not just my immediate family, but also a great tribe of cousins. So I've always, I don't know, I've always had a lot to do with children, and a fascination remains with me on what they're thinking and how they see the world.
Now, I had the privilege of meeting a mutual friend, a talented author and writer by the name of Lisa Clifford. I met her recently and we were chatting about your book, and both of us looked at the opening line of your story. And I have to say, it's one of the best opening lines I've seen in a while. It brilliantly encapsulates everything this book is about, and it reads, "I am Allegra on one side and Allie down the other." Is that always the way that you intended to open this novel?
Um, Look, it was the opening line for a long time, and and then it follows, and sometimes I split myself in two. So I think for me, it was kind of the true north point on the compass, if you like. Once I got that opening line down, and it pointed me in the direction of who she was, how she saw herself, how she related to the world, and it was just a good start for me. And I've kind of expected, I suppose, to change it at some point, because you don't always stick with your first thoughts. Obviously, I wrote this book over many years, but it did remain, and to me, it kind of does wrap up Allegra and Ali, and then of course it goes into she's kind of almost seen as different people by others, and she sees herself in different ways according to how she's relating to other people as well. So there's some other names apart from Ali and Allegra that come up in the book, as you will know, having read it.
Indeed. And yeah, absolutely. I've already had the pleasure of reading this beautiful book, but for listeners who haven't, can you tell me a little bit more about it?
So it's set in 1970s North Bondi, Sydney, in the second wave, during the second wave of the women's movement. And Allegra is an 11-and-a-half-year-old girl at the beginning of the book, and it's told through her voice and her perspective. And she's being read by two totally different grandmothers. They live next door to each other, so that's a bit unusual. But the first grandmother, Mathilde, is a Hungarian refugee Holocaust survivor, and her version of love is the hot meal on the table every night at 6 o'clock, piano practice supervised, times tables heard. Mathilde does piecework for the rag trade, so she's a seamstress, but she works from home. And she is very ambitious for Allegra to become a doctor. She is devoted to Allegra's well-being, but she's quite stern and austere. Then, literally over the fence, through the brown gate next door, is Joy. And Joy is Allegra's other grandmother. And she is embracing the second wave of the women's movement. She belongs to Liberty Club, which is a consciousness raising club. She has a little penny tortoise whom she calls Simone de Beauvoir, and she collects every tear that she ever sheds in little glass bottles that she dates and labels. And her version of love is reach your potential, live your true essence, self-actualization. Then out the back, above the garage in a flat, is Rick. And Rick is, he calls her Al Pal actually, and he is Ali's father. And he's a carpenter and a surfer and a really good bloke, but he's kind of pushed out by these two strong grandmothers, two strong women. And Allegra's mother is off the scene, and the reveal for that occurs during the book. But these three adults in her life cherish her, but they don't speak to one another. So she has to orbit their three adult worlds. So it kicks off from there. My background being in journalism, I, in fact, interviewed scores and scores of people generally, but particularly women, about their experiences in the 70s, which was a time of huge change. So there's actually a reimagining of some real events, such as the setting up of the first women's refuge that happened in Glebe, and a whole lot of other things. But it is a novel, so it's a work of fiction, but deeply researched.
Was there any one particular event that inspired you to write Allegra's story?
Uh, Look, some time ago, probably 10 years ago or so, my eldest daughter, who was still in her teenage years, said, I don't think I'm a feminist. I like to dress up. Anyway, we had quite the chat because at that time, 10 years ago, feminism was kind of off the agenda a little. And so we sat down, we had a big chat, and I kind of explained to my eldest daughter that, what life was like before, well, the second wave of the women's movement. I mean, of course, there were other waves before that and suffragettes before that still. But, what life was like for women and why those women at the time during the 70s had to take the steps that they did, and that many of the benefits that we live with today are as a result of the courageous, brave, and the camaraderie between those women too. And also, I wanted to let my daughters know. I have two daughters and a son in between, but I wanted them to know the history, but also the importance of remaining ever vigilant and keeping kind of the march going as well. So I guess that was one source of inspiration, just also a fascination with that time because there was so much happening. It was such a fascinating period in history. and not just for women who were, marching in the streets, but women that were in the kitchens, raising children, going back to education when Gough Whitlam made education free in the 70s. Women went back in droves, women that had been denied a tertiary education, often because, the money in a family would only go so far. So the boys got the tertiary education and the women, didn't. And many women, older women today, are still very bitter about that. So, yeah, that was one source of inspiration. And another for me, I guess, which was born out of having so many children around me in my life, was just that idea of a child's emerging identity and how, I'm sure lots of people can relate to this. When you're part of a family as a kid, and you look around you and you see so many different examples within your own family of traits, personalities, worldviews, and kids, they'll often look around and go, well, who am I like? Because, gosh, if I'm like her, I can't be like her, and yet, they're two aunts or two grandmothers, or my own mother and her sister. So, and for boys, obviously, different ideas there too. But I just think that for kids, what happens to their emerging sense of identity is an interesting idea when there's not just different perspectives in a family, but also differences within a family and conflict within a family.
You've bookended your novel with two quotes from the famous feminist writer and novelist Simone de Beauvoir, and I think it's fair to say, as you've just described, that Allegra's story is flavoured significantly by the period in which it's set, a time when there were few protections for workers, especially women workers, when women still didn't have the freedom to control their reproductive choices or proper and safe access to abortion, when there was also very little support for women and children who suffered domestic violence and abuse at the hands of their partners and fathers. So how important was this feminist thread to Allegra's story?
Look, I think it was very important. Although I wanted to introduce it gently, I didn't want to, hit readers over the head with it. I wanted it to almost bubble up in the consciousness of readers the same way as it does for Allegra in the stories, because it is told through her perspective, so it is through the eyes of a child. But it started as being important to me, and it actually only ever grew in importance. So by the time I finished the book, which was written over many years, and by then, feminism, of course, with the Me Too movement and all that's happened in the last 18 months, 2 years, was very much back on the agenda. So the timing was something that was kind of fortunate in many ways, but interesting as well.
I was thinking about this aspect of your book and reflecting on the way Allegra learns about violence against women and what it does to families and kids. And it seems to me that although there might be more awareness of domestic violence as an issue in our society, sadly, it's still a very prominent issue in Australia. So, it is, as you say, it's almost timely, despite how far the women have come and the movement, we're still facing those same kinds of issues.
Yeah, we are, which is heartbreaking on one level. But what is encouraging is that in the 70s, for women that were living with domestic violence, there was absolutely nowhere for them to go. If they finally had the courage or even the opportunity to get away, the only places that would take them were places like Salvation Army shelters that were mixed, so they had men and women. So you can imagine if you're fleeing a domestic violence situation with a couple of small children, to be thrown in with some men who are down on their luck would be, not the best circumstances to find yourself in. And they were tipped out first thing in the morning and not allowed back in until the evening. So again, if you've got a couple of small children and no money in your purse, what do you do all day? So at least now, because of the actions that these women took in the 70s with setting up the first refuge, which was in Glebe, Elsie, which was, set up quite almost spontaneously, actually, run by women for women, where they brought in legal services, health services, social services. So many women and children at that time who have since grown up have nominated, that as being a real turning point in their life. And I think there's a level of awareness now. Previously, people wouldn't even discuss it. Women wouldn't even admit to one another what they were living with. Domestic violence wasn't recognised by legislation as a crime. Police would refer to it as just another domestic. So, look, I know that we still are very saddened and disheartened by what's happening, but I do believe there's an awareness. Well, there's definitely an awareness. I think we'd all agree with that. And change afoot. And options. At least there are options for women. But we have to stay vigilant. We have to stay determined to go to the root cause of these things as well, not just provide the services for those that find themselves, in dire straits.
Now tell me about Whiskey Wendy and your inspiration for her character.
So, look, she was partly inspired by a woman when I was researching what was happening in the 70s. I came across a woman called Bessie Guthrie, who apparently kind of showed up when people like Anne Summers and Diana Beaton, Diana Beaton was a great help to me. She was a young feminist in the 70s and a friend of Anne's, and she was in fact there on the day that they burst into what were squat houses in Glebe and set them up as what became Elsie, the women's refuge. But apparently they were meeting, as a group of women, young feminists, they were meeting and speaking about, equal pay and opportunity and various issues at the time. And Bessie just showed up, and she was an older woman. She was actually, I think, in her 70s. And apparently she announced, I've been waiting for you girls to, get yourselves organised. So she had been in Glebe for many years. I think she'd worked in a variety. She'd never married or had her own family, but she'd worked in a variety of industries, including publishing. And apparently her house was a bit of an unofficial refuge. So young women, they called them often homegirls, girls that had ended up, because they were considered to be, some girls, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, because of the difficult circumstances they were living in, and often, they were sexually abused within their own families, or their own families hadn't cared for them or hadn't had the means to care for them, they were deemed to be, in moral danger. And so they would be put into homes. And they were called home girls. And they'd often escape these places. It just seems so brutally unfair. But Wendy would provide refuge for them. And apparently there was a back entrance to her house off a lane in Glebe. And there was a notice board. And so these girls could write messages for one another. Of course, it was all pre-mobile phones. And so they could write messages for one another. And Wendy, was just that harbour for them. So that was a little bit of the inspiration for Whiskey. Not Wendy, I'm sorry, Bessie Guthrie. That was a bit of a kernel of inspiration. Of course, it's again a reimagining of her character, and so I've just taken some of the threads of that and put it into Whiskey Wendy.
You paint an uplifting picture of the importance of the sisterhood and for women to have a community of other women to lean on in times of need. Do you think that was easier to achieve back in the 70s as compared with today, say when women's participation in the workforce is much higher?
Gosh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Neighbourhoods obviously were full at the time of women at home, and the barriers between neighbours, I think, were not what they are today. Even the physical barriers, I suppose I remember where I grew up, like we didn't really have fences between our neighbours, and we all scampered as children, around the neighbourhood in and out of each other's homes, and our mothers all got to know one another really well. Gosh, I don't want to say that it's not, that we don't have communities today and the sisterhood isn't flourishing, because I think in many ways we've created community through different avenues. But I don't think it happens as organically, perhaps, as it may have at the time. We've got to work harder to do it. I think it's something very much that we should shoot for.
Now, Sister Josepha, a wonderful character. She reminded me of a nun who taught me at my primary school. And as we were talking about just before we started recording, I actually also went to a small Catholic school and was encouraged to sit the selective schools exam and ended up going to Sydney High. So I ended
Incredible.
up... I really related to Allegra and her journey from that small Catholic primary school and, being influenced and being taught and nurtured by the nuns to her success at a selective school. So, Allegra's story is actually quite personal to me. And
I just find that amazing, absolutely amazing. And I promise we didn't speak before I wrote this book, did we, Claude?
No, we definitely haven't spoken before today. An amazing coincidence. And I wanted to say about Sister Josepha and of Sister Jo Mary, who was the nun in my life at the time. Both were very dedicated women who took their role as an educator very seriously. So I wanted to know, was Sister Josepha modelled on somebody you knew?
I was also taught by nuns, and I only ever had great experiences in my education with nuns. And the senior school I went to, particularly, it was run by the Sisters of the Society of the Sacred Heart, so in Sydney, and those nuns were just incredible. And they did teach me in the 70s, and I found them amazing at the time. But when I look back, that amazement only grows, because the change that those women were living with it was a time when a lot of women were actually leaving the convent, leaving the nunnery. And, they would have found themselves educating young women who had totally different views to what they would have expected them to have had when they trained to become nuns. And we were encouraged. We were, there were no limits that they imposed on us in terms of the way we saw our future. I often say they saw the good in us before we saw it in ourselves. They just propelled us towards, seeking truth, seeking social justice, empowerment. And in my acknowledgements at the end, I say that they really were a big unsung component of the sisterhood. When you think about a community of women who educated other women, but other orders of nuns were setting up hospitals, were setting up social services, were ministering to the poor, to prisoners. Really, I think nuns have played such a huge role in the development and the progress of Australian society. And I don't think they've received nearly the credit that they deserve. Pleasingly, a beautiful nun who I know, Sister Mary Shanahan, has just received in her 90s an OAM for her just in these most recent Queen's Birthdays list honours, for her role in education and mentoring young women. So she's a much-loved sister of the Society of the Sacred Heart who educated me and my children and my daughters. And I think with what's happened with the Catholic Church and the revelations in, recent times, which have been absolutely heartbreaking and, of course, need to be dealt with, and everything needs to be done to ensure that, the risk of that happening to other children, just doesn't happen again. But really, when you think about the level of contact that nuns have had with children over the years, not much has come out in that way, pleasingly. And I'm a big fan of nuns.
How much about your writing journey was influenced by being a journalist?
Look, I think a lot. I went into journalism because I love creative writing, but of course you can't do too much creative writing as a journo. You'll get sued. And then I sort of ended up, anyway, but the way life turns out, I kind of ended up being pulled away from mainstream journalism. But I was always doing, creative writing courses in my spare time, and kept thinking when the time was right, I would love to write a novel. And of course, there's no ever right, you've got to make that time. So I was just sort of writing as a hobby, I suppose, in the spare time that I had, which wasn't a lot, raising a family and working and, dealing with everything else life throws at you. But what was pleasing for me with the experience of writing this book, because in a way it's an historical fiction, was I could draw on my journalistic skills. So a lot of interviewing, a lot of research, which, of course, I trained for as a journo, then allowed me to underpin my creative writing with that. So it was great. I could kind of, I suppose, plug into both sides of what I'd always loved.
Now, your description of Mathilde's Hungarian cooking was mouth-watering. Her strudel making was a revelation. I wanted to know, was this born of your own baking skills or were you inspired by somebody else?
Well, look, I love cooking, really, really love cooking, and I've certainly done a lot of it over the years. I haven't done a lot of Hungarian cooking, I have to say. So again, I really enjoyed the research of Hungarian recipes and watched lots and lots of YouTube videos on the strudel making particularly.
Yeah.
I've never been a big baker. I'm more of a savory cook. But after I wrote that scene, I decided, and I'd finished the book. I decided, okay, I have to have a go at making the strudel. So for those that haven't read the book, there's a scene where Allegra's making a morello cherry strudel with Mathilde, and it involves spreading the great big kitchen table with a bed sheet, and you sort of work at the pastry after it's been kneaded. And you have to throw the dough 100 times from shoulder
Incredible.
height into the bowl, and then you work it out very, very gently after you've put the palm of your hands under the pastry, and you work it out gently, gently, gently round the edges till it comes out as a great big, very thin, flat pastry. And then you put the filling across it and use the bed sheet by lifting it up and rolling the pastry around the morello cherries. Anyway, I saw it done on YouTube videos by these very experienced Hungarian older women, and I thought, okay, got to have a crack at that. So a few weeks ago, I got some cousins together and their daughters and my own daughters, and we put on Franz Liszt and we made that strudel. We threw the dough 100 times. There was lots of laughter, and but it worked. And we sat down and we ate the strudel, and I have to say it was delicious.
So now that Allegra in three parts is on the shelves, are you working on anything else?
Pan Macmillan have signed me for a second novel. It actually won't be a continuation of that same story, because once you read the book, it kind of doesn't lend itself to a sequel. But I'm working on a totally different story. It's very early days, because I had to also do a complete, I thought I'd be further advanced by now actually, but I had to do a completely different edit of Allegra for the American market because it was picked up over there by a different editor, a different publisher. So that's taken some time. But it is a story that I find quite inspiring. It's a very different story. And I'm looking forward now to having, as much as I've absolutely loved being in Allegra's world, it has been a long time. And so I'm looking forward to giving her a rest and getting some other characters into my mind and working with them and seeing where they lead me.
How fabulous that you've been picked up in the US.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So when look, I never thought I'd be published at all, Claudine. I really thought this would just be something found in my post-funeral cleanup, as I think I may have mentioned to you before. But I just, the whole thing has rolled out so in such an unexpected way for me. So the fact that I was picked up in Australia was a blast, and it ended up going to a little mini auction, which blew my mind. And just as I was recovering from that, my agent called me. In fact, I was literally recovering at a yoga retreat and I wasn't meant to be on the phone. And she called me and she said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "I'm actually scampering around. I'm not meant to be on my phone. I'm meant to be in downward dog." And she said, "Well, just get a load of this. You've been picked up by Knopf, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House for the US and Canada. And I had to say to her, look, I just think that's a bit of an overreaction. It's not that good. And she laughed. She said, I've never had an author say that to me before in the face of that sort of news. But that was how I felt. And anyway, I was kind of then recovering from that, and it was picked up by UTA, which I didn't know, but it's United Talent Agency in LA, with a view to, book to film. So I went and met with them in April, and that was a lot of fun. But my agent tells me, and I can see why, that's the long game. They the lady I spoke with there had signed a deal that morning that had taken her 4 years to bring about. So yes, it's if that happens, my goodness. But I'm certainly not going to be sort of banking on that one. But it was a lot of fun to go there and meet. And you never know what might happen.
For all these aspiring writers out there who listen to this podcast, take note.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you've got a book in you, because quite a few people have said, I think I've got a book in me. And I go, well, make it your job to get it out of you.
Yeah.
Because, I really think if this can happen to me, it can happen to you. And it's a matter of chipping away at it, like making the space in your life where even if it's an hour a day, and initially, it took a little bit of self-discipline to sit down at the desk every day and write. But in the end, it got such momentum for me. It was the greater discipline was actually to walk away from it, once I'd put my hour, which became hours, in. But yeah, look, I think there's some amazing stories out there and very talented people who haven't put those stories down yet. I want to encourage younger writers, of course, but I really want to encourage older writers because for me, I sometimes think, I should have got cracking with this earlier, this novel writing thing. But I don't think I would have had the layers within me to write this book earlier in my life.
Yeah.
And people have said, there's a lot of layers in this book. And I think those layers are there because of the years I've lived. Yeah. So I think, older writers should be encouraged enormously.
Suzanne, if listeners wanted to find out more about you and your books, where can they find you?
Well, let me just look this up at the front of my book. I've been a conscientious objector up until very recently with regards to social media, I have to admit. But my agent and publisher told me, no, on you go, you've got to embrace it. So here we are. So you can visit SuzanneDaniel.net. So that's SUZANNE Daniel, DANIEL.net. And I'm also on Facebook, Suzanne Daniel Author, and Instagram. So, yeah. And I'm actually going to put up some photos quite soon of that strudel making, that episode of strudel making that we enjoyed in my home.
Oh, fantastic. I'd love to see those pictures. I wanted to thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books, and I wish you every success with this beautiful novel.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And listeners, a copy of this debut novel is up for grabs, courtesy of Pan Macmillan. If you want to be in the draw to win, you know what to do. Head over to my Instagram or Facebook account and follow the prompts. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.